What we end up with here is something really beautiful. It's in the same physical reality that we all share. So this isn't turning Genesis into a myth in any sort of way. It's reading it as a very concrete historical account that's happening in the real world that we all inhabit, that scientists study. That really we find out that Genesis and science are just telling us different aspects of the same story. When you look at the conflict over Adam and Eve, it's really been the conflict between two stories of origins, right? And one way to understand Adam and Eve, there's many ways to understand it, but this is, I think, how most Christians through history have understood it, is that Adam and Eve were created without parents less than 10,000 years ago, and they were ancestors of everyone. Note, they wouldn't have been genetic ancestors of everyone, because they didn't know about genetics back then, right? But maybe they were saying genealogical ancestry. In terms of evolution, people thought it means common ancestry with the great apes, and that we arise as a population, not a single couple. All right. And it seems like all five of those things can't all be true at once, right? You have to pick and choose on some level, and that's what most people did. Some people would reject evolution, and some people would reject or revise some understanding of Adam and Eve. What I found out is that all five of these things can be true at the same time. They're not actually in conflict with one another. Now, maybe you think evolution is a myth, and that's okay. It's still true that Adam and Eve isn't in conflict with it. Does that make sense? And maybe you think Adam and Eve are a myth. That's okay, too. But it still means that Adam and Eve is not in conflict with evolution, or evolution is in conflict with it. So how does that happen? So this is what I would call the traditional account. And we're going to look at this in a couple different ways. By traditional, I mean the way how most Christians have really understood Genesis over the last several thousand or 2,000 years, or most readers of Genesis over the last several thousand years ago. They thought we all descend from some original couple that was in the Middle East and kind of spread out across the globe. But then there was a big question mark about what happened outside the garden. People would think about it different ways. People would wonder about Cain's wife. People would wonder about the Nephilim. And that was an open question that people wondered about. Now, one way to understand that is to erase the question mark and say there was no one out there. That's one way to read it. And I guess that might be consistent with Scripture. But it's certainly not demanded by Scripture is the point. And certainly, if you look at the history of interpretation of Genesis, which certainly helps us here, long before evolution, people were wondering about people outside the garden. And all I really pointed out is that, well, if there were people outside the garden that God had created through a process of common descent, he could have still de novo created from the dust a special couple amidst them, in a divinely created garden, perhaps as recently as 6,000 years ago, or maybe 10,000 years ago. Science wouldn't really tell us. And when they fell, they would exit the garden, and they would interbreed with these people that God had created a different way. And by that mixing of different lineages would give rise to all of us. So we're all descendants of Adam and Eve, just as the church has taught for thousands of years, and most readers of Genesis have understood. But we're also part of another story, too, that we're also descendants of the people outside the garden. So what we end up with here is something really beautiful. It's in the same physical reality that we all share. So this isn't turning Genesis into a myth in any sort of way. It's reading it as a very concrete historical account that's happening in the real world that we all inhabit, that scientists study. That really we find out that Genesis and science are just telling us different aspects of the same story. On one hand, Genesis is telling us the story of Genesis, like the first covenantal humans that fall, and their fall has impact on all of us in an important, profound way. But this is really in the blind spot of science. Genetics doesn't really speak to this. It can't really speak to this. It's telling us a different story about the people God had created outside the garden. And those people aren't as important to the covenantal story of Scripture, which is why Scripture doesn't really talk about it.